Hi, I'm Lyle. I'm principal academic in health and science communications at Bournemouth University. And I'm stepping in here last minute. So if you were expecting someone else, I'm very sorry, but hopefully I can still entertain you or inform you in some way. So I'm gonna share screen here. I always click share sound. And this, you should be able to see the Miro board with slides. Yes, I see nods. Okay, great. So let me put this in full screen. Excellent. Okay. So I'm gonna be talking, I'm gonna sort of hop around between a couple of different ideas and subjects and disciplines. This, depending on the audiences, can be a 20-minute talk or it can be a 2-hour talk based on the interdisciplinarity. So I'm going to explain every topic as thoroughly as I can, because I know we've got a wider audience. But please let me know if there's anything that I'm saying where you're like, what are you talking about? This, I don't know. So the link to the slides is here. You've got a bit.ly link and you have a QR code if that helps, depending on what device you're on. So everything that's in the slides, it's public, you can have access to it. So don't worry if I skip through something or there's a link that you want to click. So as Mona mentioned, this is research that is included in my book that came out in January, Never-Ending Stories, The Popular Emergence of Digital Fiction. There is still a discount going, so you can get 35% off. There are discount codes. Order for your library, ask your library to order it, or send me an email. And I can help you out. But this is the link to the book. And hopefully it will be interesting on multiple levels. So that's where this research is coming from. So in terms of interactive fiction, which is the case study that I'm talking about, I was doing some background research for this book. This book was all about digital fiction, how it's emerged, you know, what it looks like around the world, what different cultures do in terms of computers and digitized narratives. And we're talking about narratives that require a digital device to work. So things like interactive fiction, text adventure games, hypertext stories, walking sims, these sorts of things. That's my main field. And interactive fiction is a key one for me as I talk about popular digital fiction, because it is a key model of successful commercial digital fiction and one of the few. And so I was looking into the history of the primary company that is known for interactive fiction, or as it was known then, text adventure games. And it's very closely linked with the history of computers and computing and games. But as I started to look into it, I in the words of Dean and Sam from Supernatural, something hinky was going on. There are two main texts about this particular era of digital fiction. One is a documentary called Get Lamp, and the other is a academic critical text. It's textbook / research, edited volume on the IF theory reader. And it was interesting to me that in this 2-hour documentary, Got Lamp, it was all talking heads, and in 2 hours there were only 3 women presented, and they had a total talking time of less than 5 minutes. And then in the IF theory reader, out of around 30 chapters, only 2 were written by women, and it was the same woman. And so this to me was like, what this is not right. So I dug a lot deeper, and it caused me to have a lot of thoughts about computing and its history and how it's influenced how we think about digital fiction and even literature and games and computing today. And so that's what I dug into for this chapter. So a little bit of background in terms of women's work. Linda Notchlin wrote this fantastic essay in 1971, which posited this sort of tongue-in-cheek question: why are there no good women artists? And it isn't because there aren't good women artists, it's because of these factors that have prevented the discourse, prevented the recognition of women in art. And I looked at women in art, women in literature and publishing, and women in computing for these frames, because that's kind of where digital fiction comes from those three threads. So as she pointed out, that historically women have had a lack of access to education and apprenticeships, so that limits their ability to become great artists. Society expects them to be mothers and wives first. We still haven't really gotten away from this. The women, professional women will get these questions of, how is it to be a woman and a professional? Whereas men don't, have you left your children behind to go to work? No, they never get that question. Institutions favor those most like themselves. Again, men. I mean, look at most of our management teams across the board in almost every industry. Women's art is also, anything that is feminized is devalued, and we'll see more of this on the next slide, that it's folk art, the things that women typically work with, like textiles and knitting and crochet and tapestry, or it's primitive. And it's so it's not fine art. And then the women often lack role models and networking structures, right? There's an old boys network in almost every industry, and art is no different. And then there's the unconscious bias that it's so difficult to fight against, is that results in things like lower purchase prices for art by all historically marginalized people: women, people of color, LGBTQ, disabled people, all across the board. If you're not a white man, then you're not that genius, and so just unconsciously we value it less. In terms of the feminine and literature and publishing, the feminine is very devalued, and we see this in lots of ways. Even though books and reading and publishing and literature are fields in which women can be very prominent, and in fact, a lot of people point to the fact that in the publishing industry, 80% of the publishing industry are women. And we've got some statistics here that show that despite the fact that 80% of women in publishing are women, it dies out at the higher levels of management. In CEOs, there's still that 15% pay gap in publishing. And then we see it in things like where we describe genres. We talk about kid lit or children's lit, that it's not real lit, but we talk about Lewis Carroll and Dr. Seuss and Roald Dahl and Frank Baum as that they transcend literature, that young adult, young girls are silly, and so we poke fun at the Twilight and the Hunger Games and all of that, but really I read a lot of young adult because, quite frankly, it's where the innovation in a lot of fiction is happening. Romance, it's only literature if it's about men and their approach to romance, then it's literature. If it's from a women's perspective and based on the female gaze, then it's romance, and it's trash, and forget about it. Despite the fact that romance is a massive genre and earns millions of dollars, possibly billions of dollars world, it's the most successful genre in literature. It's just romance. Fan fiction historically has been primarily written by women. And so there's this notion that it's derivative, that women are just mimicking it. But when it's professional practice, such as in TV writing, where in order to get a job in TV, you write a essentially a fan fiction script of a show to get on in the writer's room of that show. Women's stories, we carve things off. Women's fiction, Black fiction, Asian fiction, all of these sorts of things, we carve them off. LGBTQIA fiction, and we carve them off so that they're separate. And the idea is that, so that we can recognize them, but really it's more marginalizations in some ways. There's some, and then we call it hobbyist. It's not real, it's not serious. Or applied. Things that are applied are often feminized, because they're not theoretical, they're not sort of again that high art or fine thinking or intellectual, as it were, so they get feminized and it becomes fluff. Even in the publishing industry, we have false equalities. Even though women make up the majority of readers, they read more often than men, as a binary. Prize winners tend to be men. Here we see literary prize winners by or about by gender. The orange is that the work is either about a male protagonist, or by a male author. The green is that's just women. The yellow is both. So you can see where, and then when we take out the prizes for children, how much worse it becomes if the author is a woman and she's writing about women. And so the prizes are very gender biased. And then the other graphs show that one of the reasons for this is that men tend to prefer works by or about men, whereas women tend to not care as much. And so you have this portion that will only read men by men, and then a portion that will read everything. And so that skews the numbers in favor of works by men. We have this notion in the sciences, there's been a long history of women's exclusion from sciences, and we're going to talk more about that in terms of specifically of computing. And there are these theories about the exclusion. We have one is the exceptional woman, right? And there's an image here of Marie Curie, as, if she could do it, why couldn't everyone? She didn't let all of the women's roles and exclusion hold her back. So that just means the rest of you were somehow weaker. If one woman can do it, you all can. And so you need to stop whining. And that, that holds true. We see that discourse around Tiger Woods in golf, and the Williams sisters in tennis, and all these sorts of things where, they could do it, why couldn't the rest of you? And then which is very harmful, because it doesn't at all lower any of the barriers to anyone else. It just means that nobody bothers to work on it anymore because one woman broke through, and so there must not be a problem. And then there's what Margaret Rossiter calls the Matilda effect, which is that any woman who's part of a team tends to be marginalized in favor of the men on her team. So we see this in massive ways in things like, we talk about the discovery of DNA by Watson and Crick, and quite often we textbooks chop off the fact that actually it was Rosalind Franklin who took a freaking picture. Her X-ray crystallography really was the defining key aspect of identifying the structure of DNA. She unfortunately died before the Nobel Prize was awarded, and they don't award them posthumously. And so she was left off of that prize, and she's been largely deliberately left off by James Watson in his writings and his discourse. And so her work was forgotten and marginalized for quite a long time. That effect is the same for women who a lot of women scientists work with their husbands. Marie Curie was one, but they tend to be seen as like the person who types up the papers or does the busy work, and so they don't receive as much recognition for their work, even if they're the lead on a team, or they're quite prominent and important to the work they are subsumed. We see this even in subtle effects such as journalism, where a male member of the team will be referred to by his title, Professor such and such, and then Julie also contributed, where women tend to lose their titles and lose this distinguishment and recognition from journalists, whereas men will receive their titles, and it's very subtle. And it is that Matilda effect of you're less important than this man in this particular group. In computing is a really interesting area, because unlike even literature or general science, these are fields where men dominate, and women have had to make inroads in order to become recognized and become equal. Well, women in computing have always been in computing, and in many ways shaped and made computing what we know it as. It was seen as for a long time as women's work. We know that we talk about Alan Turing and his first theorization of a computing machine, and his work in World War II, and we know about Charles Babbage and his theorization. It's important to point out that Ada Lovelace, who was Lord Byron's daughter, no offense to her, she is known for writing the first published computer algorithm. And then there was ChatGPT. I mean, from that work, from her initial work comes all that follows. And so her work was extremely important. The first computers, the term referred to people who did calculations by hand, heavy calculations that they needed to do things like get people to, rocket ships to the moon and decrypt encrypted messages during World War II, etc. So we have a lot of women working at NASA, which we sort of has been in much more discourse recently with films like Hidden Figures, which focused on Katherine Johnson and her contributions to NASA's orbital missions. It wasn't until 2000, I think 2002, that we even knew about the 8,000 women who worked at Bletchley Park, in the Bletchley Park programming, decrypting and encrypting Allied messages and decrypting Axis messages during World War II. All of the computers there were destroyed for intelligence and national security purposes, and it was kept secret for decades afterward who worked there and what they worked on. And so we can only recognize that 80% of the 10,000 people who were at Bletchley Park were women working in these programs. Grace Hopper is known for creating the first compiler. That's a program that creates other programs. So it's the beginnings of automation and computers doing things for us and having this element of like thinking and being able to carry out complex tasks rather than just being big calculators. Hedy Lamarr is her co-invention of frequency hopping, which you see a diagram for there in the lower right of the images, is responsible for Wi-Fi. The reason that we can have wireless communications is down to her invention. It's interesting that in the early days of computing, emphasis was very much placed on the hardware. How do we make the computer work? Not how do we program it and put information into it, but how do we make the buttons and lights and circuits work? Eventually they came to term these two areas hardware and software, and it's very interesting that those are very gendered terms. Men worked on the hardware, they worked on the machines. Women worked in the software, so that they're feminized to begin with. And then during after World War II in both the US and the UK, as the men returned home, and the industry and governments said, oh, we need the jobs for men, and computing is this massive industry. We want men to go into these roles and control, take over these jobs. Women can go back home. They rephrased it as software engineering to harden it up, even though there's no, what relation to engineering does programming have? None. But they named it that so that it would be more attractive to men. And so that men would fulfill those roles and push women out of computing. And we have this history post World War II, particularly in the UK, of the computing industry here being under government control and largely driven by government, and this desire for a national computing evolution. And yet anytime a woman got married or pregnant, hopefully in that order, she was retired. She, much like a Blade Runner, she was forced out of the workplace. She was given a grand party and a cake and was like shown the door. You are a wife and a mother first. You cannot work here. And I'll talk more about Elsie Schutt and Stephanie Shirley later, because they took advantage of that and were highly successful in taking advantage of that practice. So Mar Hicks wrote a fantastic book, which is linked in the references, about this history. And they say, although seemingly two very different issues, the failure of International Computers Limited, which was the UK's computer industry, it was government driven. It was the big computing industry in the UK. And the continued failure to equalize women's place in the labor market both had their roots in the same soil. Attempts to engineer a computerized state that gave government more top-down control and strengthened existing hierarchies of gender and class. So as much as possible, labor forces and labor markets and labor policies were created that kept women out of computing post-World War II and pushed them out of management, pushed skilled laborers out of roles where they could contribute to computing, and put unskilled men in and paid them higher and gave them better titles. And this is what killed that International Computers Limited, which was the computing industry in the UK. So classism and sexism for the win there. Not at all. That was sarcasm. When we talk about interactive fiction and digital fiction, and the particular case study that I looked at here, the origins of interactive fiction, much like the origins of computing, come from the work of women. The very first digital fiction that I can identify, now it may not have been the very first one, but it's the very first one that is spoken about in any kind of literature, is the Sumerian game. IBM in the early 1960s, 1962, 1963, put out this ad. They wanted people to write stories to come up with applications for their new computers that were starting to be, as we move from warlike applications of decryption and encryption and ballistics trajectories and things like that, and move into industry. IBM's trying to commercialize what they do, and they want to find ways to reach businesses and education. And so Mabel Addis designed this civilization simulator as a history lesson into the Sumerian era. And so it was the first, and so they teamed up and created the Sumerian game together. And you can see a girl playing it there on the first computers. You type in inputs, and a printer would give you outputs based on what you told it. And in the field of electronic literature and digital fiction, we don't talk about Mabel Addis. We haven't. This particular story that I'm going to walk you through here is the one that is most often cited as the origins of digital fiction itself, and digital fiction, and indeed computer gaming. So this story that has been told over and over and over, and you can see at the bottom there's references here, and you can see just how many times it's told over and over and over and over. It is just the apocryphal beginnings of digital fiction, and it is the common ancestor of digital fiction and computer gaming. The story goes that in the early 1970s, Will Crowther, who was an avid Dungeons and Dragons player, a caver, and he worked as a programmer, and he was recently divorced. And being recently divorced, he wanted to be able to connect more closely with his kids. He wasn't getting to spend as much time with his kids as he did before. And so in his spare time, he used the programming language Fortran, and his experiences as a spelunker in the Mammoth Cave system in Kentucky to create a computer game called Colossal Cave Adventure. And it was the first text adventure game. You can still play it. You are exploring this cave. You are a spelunker, and it's known for being very accurate as to the cave system and having just an exploratory aspect. He released it on the burgeoning internet at the time, what was called ARPANET, and that was around 1975. We're not sure. Different versions exist, and it went around, and it sort of like broke the internet at the time. All of computing stopped, every programmer stopped and just played this game. It floated around ARPANET, and Don Woods, another programmer, picks it up and goes, "Oh, this would be really cool if we added some winning states, a point system, gamified it essentially." And he contacted Will Crowther and said, "Is it okay if I do this?" And Will Crowther was like, "Yeah, sure, whatever." And so he released. So it's this weird collaboration, but not really, between Crowther and Woods. It gets released back onto the ARPANET. It hits a group of MIT programmers who go, "We can do this. This is fantastic." They form a company called Infocom. And by 1979 and /1980, 1979 was as they develop Zork and form Infocom. They released Zork as a commercial computer game. Apple packaged Zork with their new personal home computers. It was a massive hit. I mean, millions of dollars, and everybody played text adventure games, and you can see it. It is referenced even today in media. There's a whole episode of Big Bang Theory that references, and where they play Zork. And when Interstellar, the film, came out, as part of the marketing for that film, they released a text adventure game based in the interstellar world that you could go and play. You could explore different planets for their habitability. And it gave rise to commercial computer games as we know it. So in all that seems very, it's a cool story. It's very straightforward. But it has fridged a lot of women in that story. And the notion of fridging comes from comics writer Gail Simone. And she was talking specifically about comics and how frequently women, the female characters in these stories, are used simply as motivation for the male hero. So it's this notion of the hard-bitten detective's wife gets killed, and so he's going to, get the bad guy as revenge. So she's killed almost immediately in the story, and we see it over and over and over and over and over and over and over. And the fridging specifically refers to an issue of the Green Lantern in which his girlfriend is literally killed, cut up, and put in a refrigerator to motivate his story for the rest of the story. So we call this, and now that I've explained this to you, if you didn't know fridging before, now you will see it in so many television and films. I mean, from action heroes to just about everything. It's always like, let's kill the woman so that the man has something to care about. What isn't told in this story is that it was Will's wife who was the caver. She was actually a really well-known caver. She was responsible for finding the connection between two massive cave systems in the US. She was rather famous. And it was her maps of Mammoth Cave that Will used, her knowledge of Mammoth Cave. He was kind of an also ran. He went with her because it was her hobby. So there's a Matilda effect going on there, that he was the caver. They did it together. The divorce is Will's motivation for creating the story. So Pat gets fridged there. Pat was also a programmer. And she very easily, she also went to MIT, very easily could have probably created something like this. Probably. But we have to remember that at the same time that Will got divorced and had all this free time to create a game because he was recently divorced and didn't have childcare responsibilities, she now had more childcare responsibilities because she was a single mother. So we sort of skip over all of that because we want to hear about the game. Also of note is that both of their children were girls. So the very first gamers that we know about were girls. And the game was created for girls in a language, Fortran, that was created by Grace Hopper, by a woman programmer. So that's frustrating in and of itself. That's the discourse about early computer games that we see, that completely cuts all of the feminine contributions to gaming and computing out of the discourse. And then we talk about Infocom, and I realize we're at about 20 till, so we'll get through here. Infocom rather famously was the computer gaming company of the 80s. If we are talking about text adventure games in the 80s, we're almost always talking about Infocom games. And there are two in the literature, there are two reasons given for why Infocom failed spectacularly in the late 80s, just crashed and burned. One is that graphics killed the text adventure game. Once graphics came along, nobody wanted to play text adventure games anymore. And this is very misleading because graphic adventure games evolved right alongside text adventure games. The first graphic adventure game was Mystery House in 1980, so it's coming out at the same time as Zork, so it was always a competitor. And LucasArts' beautiful Labyrinth came out in 1986, so they were always there. It wasn't some new evolution. And then there's also pointing to poor business decisions, which indeed was a contributing factor. They had aggressive expansion. Once they made all their millions and they were very well known for computer games, they went, great, we're going to sink all of our new investment and hire tons of new people to write business software. Really great decision for a company that's known as a gaming company. So they couldn't get loans because it was so risky. Everybody was like, why? You're not known for this. But they wanted to be seen as serious programmers. So they pushed and pushed and pushed and got loans they couldn't afford anyway. And they didn't know much about what they were doing in business software, so they're expanding rapidly and aggressively into an unknown area, and they absolutely refused to listen to anyone who told them that this was a bad decision. And so they eventually had to sell to Activision, which persists to this day, and notably has gender issues to this day. In fact, is the state of California has sued Activision for its discriminatory policies and its embedded culture of harassment. So in reframing the history, if we look at Infocom, there were no women on the board of Infocom. There was one or two women who were involved in writing or designing the games. Only one game ever in their entire catalog was aimed at women, and they were apologetic for that in the marketing. It was men writing for men, bundling games into the PC market that was marketed solely at men and boys. Computers were for men and boys. They were situated in either a shared space, or they were in the boys' bedroom or the man of the house's office. So women had to literally encroach into men's spaces in order to get to computers. Infocom always said it was aimed for an audience of heavy readers, but they excluded the majority of heavy readers, which were women. So they lost more than half of their potential market. And they made risky business decisions that are far more likely decisions that are going to be made by men than by women. Men will take more risk, and men will ignore advice to the contrary, such as banks not willing to give them a loan for these risky decisions. So it was like the UK's computing industry. It was the exclusion of women in their model that brought down Infocom. Because we can see that there are examples of success in two separate and independent software programming companies, Computations Inc., which was started by Elsie Schutt, and Freelance Programmers Limited, run by Steve Shirley. One was in the US, one was in the UK, post-World War II, as as both these women lost their jobs either at IBM or International Computers Limited, which was the UK's big industry. They got pregnant and they got retired. And they went, I still want a job. I still want to do my stuff. So what they did was they took all of this masses of women who were getting excluded from that labor force, but had brilliant skills because they were excellent programmers in these big corporations, these big companies, and said, you can work from home remotely. They created modular systems where different women could work on different parts of the program at a time in a cookbook philosophy, so that there was standards where you always knew what you were doing and you could put these pieces together like Legos. Because they were doing it that way, they had to have higher standards of quality assurance so that you could be assured that if you hired their software firm, you were going to get a good job. They focused on the smaller, stable jobs instead of making risky decisions. And anytime they had profits, they reinvested them in their companies and in training for their employees rather than rapid expansion. The Freelance Programmers Limited exists to this day. And Computations Inc. was a successful business for 45 years until Elsie Schutt retired. During a time in which an estimated half of software firms went under. Examples of systems by women. And the other cool thing was that they kept hiring people as IBM and ICL kept firing them. And so they were constantly on top of the new technology as they were getting this knowledge that was coming out of the corporation. So that was also, I love that aspect. It was like, fine, fire them, we'll take them, come with your up-to-date knowledge and experience and connections. So women running things can provide an excellent model of how not to be Infocom, not to flash and burn. So that's it. I generally have a call to action, because this is not a historical problem. This is still going on. So we can all do things that to push back against this devaluation of feminized work. And I say feminized, when I say feminized, I'm including all areas where we exclude people. So intersectional feminized work. So if we are devaluing work by women, we are also devaluing work by people of color, by LGBTQ, by those who are disabled, by migrants, by anything that is not part of the dominant hegemony. So keep pushing, keep fighting, keep doing things that push back against the patriarchy. Again, all references are here on the slides. And the link is on the title slide. There. Thank you very much.